Hi there, I'm Tan and welcome to the first video in the slideshow series. In this episode we're going to be looking at the problem as a whole before we actually start going into the coding. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so as I said before, this video is really going to be looking at the problem first, okay? In fact, this whole series is going to be focused not just on the coding, but on the thought processes of what we're doing, okay? And one of the reasons for this is that it's actually based on an old assignment which we don't do anymore in our college for a course that doesn't exist. And so what they had to do was to design a solution for a problem. And so in this one, they are doing a JavaScript slideshow, okay? And this is essentially what they were given. So this top bit was the requirement, okay? So that to use JavaScript. The application had to accept the HTML tag for where the slideshow was going to appear. It had to accept a list of image URLs. The first image in this had to be displayed as the main image. All images in the 16:9, but maybe in different resolutions, but they had to be shown in 1200 by 675. A thumbnail of each image was to be displayed below the main image as a line of or a grid if there are more than 20 thumbnails. Thumbnails have a very specific size of 48 by 27 pixels, which actually is really small. Thumbnails are to be made from the original image, and when a thumbnail is pressed, that becomes the main image. So that seems to be the rotation requirement for the slideshow. And then we have a list of extras, okay? So these are things that they need to do, and then the idea is that it allowed them to customize it. And as you can see, there's quite a few here, but I'll go through it quickly. So title and descriptive text could be accompanying the image, which changes the way that we might accept that image into the application. So title shown top left hand corner, description shown between the image and the thumbnails. So this is important because it's telling us how it should be looking, okay? A next and previous buttons are halfway down the main page that moves through the images. I think that's badly written, but I think it means that we could basically next and previous buttons. The gallery automatically moves through the images in a 5-second intervals. That's actually quite a difficult ask to do. An option to use pre-made thumbnails instead of generating your own. An option to use dots instead of thumbnails. The ability to move dots onto the image. Okay, so they're not at the bottom anymore. An option where the title, description, and thumbnails can be moved to the left or right of the main image. So again, we're changing how it could look. An option where the size of the main image can be given. An option where the size of the thumbnails can be given. An option where the description of text only appears when the main image is rolled over. That there is another area where the description of the thumbnail is displayed when the thumbnail is rolled over. So that's an interesting one. Not over the main image, although that was up here, I think, but also over the thumbnail. And then an option when the main image is not initially shown, and the thumbnails are more like carousels. And when the thumbnails are clicked, you get a big picture. And then any other features you feel fit. So the idea here was that we're looking at basically creating what seems to be a fairly simple slideshow, okay, and then giving people the options to be able to customize it so that they could use it perhaps in their own website that they are creating. And so like I said, in this video we're looking at the the problems we identify, and then how do we solve these problems, okay? And so the first thing we've got to look at and say to ourselves is, well, how is our slideshow meant to look? Because this is one of the things that a lot of people forget. It doesn't matter if it's web design, it doesn't matter if it's coding. People don't plan. You've got that silly saying, but it's a good one. You know, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. And it's absolutely true. Unless you know what you're trying to code, what you're trying to do, you will not be able to be successful, because how do you know that you've got to your target? So that's our first thing. So the first problem that we're identifying here is we don't know what the slideshow should look like. And so our solution is to draw it. Okay, and before I go any further, I got requests a shout out, and I like doing them halfway through. I say I like doing it, this is my first one. So Shami, this is your shout out, this is for you. Okay, so I've actually done a really bad drawing of what this says, and it looks like this. Okay, I'll make it clear, this is not to scale at all. All right, it's nowhere near to scale, and it doesn't have to be. Okay, it doesn't have to be. You know, ideally it would be, but it doesn't have to be. Okay, but it gives us an idea of what we're trying to create. And as we said with the extras, we can change that, but this is what must be made first, and then the options come in later. So we've got our main image at 1200 by 675. Okay, these green ones are actually the optionals. These are the before and next buttons. We've got a section below it where we have the description, which again is one of the options. This bit doesn't have to be here. And then we have the thumbnails, and we can see definitely not to size or even to the right, what do you call it, ratio. These are squares and they should be more like rectangles. Okay, but there are 20 in the row. And that's basically the design. And the reason why this is important, okay, the reason why this design is important is because that affects the HTML. Okay, because if you know, just move this to the side, go over there. You know, what it says is that the application will accept the HTML tag where the slideshow carousel should appear. But it doesn't give us the HTML structure, okay, the structure of the slideshow, and that implies that we will be creating that structure, okay, and that puts us into another potential question. Do we do it so that we actually have a page like this, and then in here we're putting in, you know, let's call it slidey. Are we saying that slizzy? That's a good one. Let's go for slidey. Okay. Are we saying that the person who wants slideshow has to create the HTML? Because that doesn't sound like a good idea to me. We've got a section and an area where we want it to go, but what we need to do is to decide what our HTML structure is. Because even though the actual requirements for this is smallish, really you need to be looking at problems ahead of you, things that, you know, the what people might call the fringe events, okay, the edge cases. So you know, what it doesn't say in here is whether or not there's more than one slideshow. Okay, would there be more than one slideshow on a page? And if there is more than one slideshow on a page, how does that affect how we do things? And actually it has a massive effect on how we do things. Okay, and like I say, we'll probably go into it in the next one, but these are sort of things that you have to think about before you write a single line of code. I mean, obviously I've already started, or I haven't started really. You can just see I've got the startup for this project, you know, slideshow HTML, JavaScript and CSS file. And if you're wondering how to start this up or how to do Visual Studio Code or anything like that, there are some videos which I'll put the links in the description. I'm using my fingers. There's no camera on me, but have a look up below. That's where you're going to see them, on how to do the basic setups, or at least a similar setup. Okay, so before you do anything, you need to look at this and say to yourself, what do I want to do? What are the problems, or what are the solutions that I see? So there are many problems that we can have. So what I'm going to do is just write out a few problems, including the ones that we've actually already given a solution to, and then we can look at those one to one. Okay, so here is a bunch of considerations. Just like the text above, feel free to freeze this and copy these down yourselves if you're going to follow along actively, which is what I recommend. But as you can see, I've basically broken it down into 4 sections, and these are literally off the top of my head. Okay, these aren't pre-planned. These were made literally, I paused this, wrote some out, and then restarted the video. So it's not exhaustive, it doesn't cover everything, but I basically got it down into 4 areas. Okay, the HTML, the sort of how we're going to code it and the issues with the coding, CSS, and the image. Okay, so with this top one, we've done some of this already. What does the slideshow look like? And based on what we've looked at in the requirements, I still think that this is a good enough example. These green arrows don't need to be there, the description doesn't need to be there, but this is, considering the extras, this is like the first level that I'm going to be aiming for. Okay, that's what I'm going to try and make, at least to start with. So we know what it looks like. The next stage with that particular issue is to start looking at the HTML structure that will be required. Then we have this issue, like I was aiming at that I was thinking about before. Who creates the HTML structure? Should the person who's building a website put that data in, or should it be the coder, the person who's creating the slideshow? And this one I will answer now. It should be the person who's creating the slideshow, because if you're wanting this to be easy to use, and I think this is actually point 2 is sort of covered here in point 2.3 here. You want to make it as easy as possible for your client to use your product. And you don't want to be saying to them, right, you need to write all this HTML done, and oh look, you've got 50 images, you've got to add all these 50 little divs or whatever it may be. And that's, you can't ask for that. That is asking them to do too much. If you're going to make that whole web page, that might be a different story. If you are just making this code, then I think it would be right that you create that. Then how will we create that and add that HTML? Well, that's quite a big topic on its own, so we'll look at that another time. So then we'll come back to another question that I talked about. What if there is more than one slideshow? I mean, it has a huge implication on how we code it. Because if we are just going, and again, it comes down to the paradigm, okay? These two sort of work together. So here we're talking about, are we writing it at like a procedural level? Are we looking at event-driven? And this is a very much an event-driven system. But if we're having more than one slideshow on the screen, we don't want to be writing multiple versions of the code just for multiple slideshows. So this does push us towards the idea of doing an object-orientated type of programming, and I appreciate that might scare a lot of people off. And I'm going to be honest with you, we're not talking about doing everything, in like real hardcore OOP, but this might actually act as a nice introduction to object-orientated programming. Should the code be portable? I'm going to say yes. Okay, if we've already made the decision that we're going to create the HTML and that we're going to do it object-orientated, we should be able to create a script that we can then just dump into any website. And again, point 2.3, how easy should it be? It should be extremely easy. It should be as easy as being able to say, this is where I want your slideshow to go, do it. Okay? Should the code be easily expanded? And again, I think this is one of the beauties of doing it in OOP, is the code should be easily expanded. Okay, we've looked, we saw all of these things up here. Okay, and out of all those, I only picked up a couple of the extra ones to make our design. But there's nothing stopping us once we've got to this and this is working, that we can't say, well, okay, let's add some extra bits. For example, I don't like the idea of these images being that small. 48 by whatever it was, 27 is absolutely tiny. You won't be able to see any detail on that image. So, being able to change that would be really good. So trying to build it in such a way that we can add to it is really important. And with that being the case, that kind of does knock out the idea of procedural programming anyway, because that is very sort of heavily structured. Start line 1, end at line whatever it is, 1000, and go to line 2, 3, and 4 as you go along. Yes, it does allow for functions. Yes, it does allow for loops and stuff like that. But once you've designed your code and you write it, when you try to modify it, it can become really difficult to contain. So going with an object-oriented approach is a really good idea. How to attach the CSS. And now this is another interesting problem, because and also, all three of these sort of like explaining in sort of one argument really. There are three ways essentially that we attach CSS: an externally linked CSS file, an internal CSS file, and inline CSS rules. The golden standard, if you like, is having external CSS files. Now that's not really possible when you're doing it with multiple slideshows. If you're only going to have one slideshow, you could get away with it. Okay, you could get away with it. You say to the person, right, for this slideshow, you need to attach this CSS rule. Okay, this page, this is a CSS file, and this is a JavaScript file, and they work together. The problem with that is if you've got more than one slideshow on a page, because if they looked identical, that wouldn't be a problem. If they looked identical in that, the main image was always the same size, they had the same number of thumbnails and all that, you could get away with it. But what if they are different sizes? What if you're using a timer and you've decided to allow them to choose how often they move? What I'm thinking of, you could do classes. And again, we then got a problem is, well, we don't know what else is on that page. A class called thumbnail, for example, how do we know that they don't already have somewhere else on that page another set of thumbnails with that class of thumbnail? So that, this CSS is actually quite a complex problem. It implies that we can't do an external linked file, because to do that we'd have to program that in JavaScript, and you can't make files on client-side code. If we were doing this in something like Node.js, we could perhaps, fake that, but we can't do that. So the JavaScript's going to have to create the files, because we've got, we might have multiple slideshows, with slightly different rules per slideshow, and that then gives us either an internal or inline rules. And it might even be the case that we use a combination of both. Okay, this is I think the term's a quagmire, a can of worms. It's not nice. Then we look at number 4, which is the images. Okay, so first of all, how do we get the images data? Because again, we're creating a slideshow, but we're actually creating a code which runs the slideshow. And yes, from point 1, we're looking at creating the HTML. But when we are creating this slideshow, we don't know how many images are going to be used, which again causes problems of how it's going to be viewed and stuff like that. But it means that we've got to build in a system in which the data is passed over to our JavaScript, and we've got to work out how that's going to work. Now, what form should that take? And that's an interesting question, and this again goes back greatly to how easy your slideshow is going to be. If you're just going to do this really basic one, okay, where you just need a list of images, then a simple array of the images would work absolutely fine. And in the array, I don't think it would really matter if it is relative or absolute. The image links to other sites, well, again, that's an absolute issue. Okay, I give them an absolute reference. Now, there could be problems with them linking to other images due to restrictions on the browsers. I think it's called cross-site forgeries, basically trying to stop you from either scraping stuff from other websites or actually presenting information which has actually come from a third party. So, but that is really something that you could put into your notes for the user. Say, look, if you want to do it from another website, you may need to change permissions on your website to allow that data in, and you could either give them example code and how it's done. Okay, and that is a sort of after customer care issue. So we can sort of ignore point 4.3 really, because even though it is a kind of a valid issue, it's not our issue. It's not an issue that we need to deal with, it's an issue that the customer needs to deal with, and we could charge them extra for that at a later point. If we go back to the form of the data to take, like I said, if we're just doing single images and nothing else, no data, then an array works well. And I like the idea of an array, but then what do we do when we've got the data? You know, when we've got the title and the description of the image, and we could have more things, okay? You know, 4.6, can other data be added and used later? So we want to do this in a way which we can expand, okay? Again, point 2.4, can we have the data in such a way that if there is additional data that's not been supported, it is ignored, but if there is additional data and it's supported, that we can use it. And that also points me to the idea of an object. And you know, perhaps what we should be doing here is looking at creating an array of objects. Okay, so each element in that array, rather than just being a link, is an actual object which contains all the information that we need about the image. And this could be handy when we think about taking it further, where perhaps if we've got a shop, we could include things such as the price. We could include hyperlinks to a separate page or to something like that. So there's, you know, it gives, you know, by having it as an object with different properties, which you think of those as variables, then it gives, you know, it really opens up the idea of what we could do with this slideshow slash character. Is there a limit to the size of the title and the description? Okay, now these can be quite interesting points, because again, if I bring this back over, we've got the description of the image here. Well, we've got a default size, and now there is no size that's been set into the requirement. You can see here that, you know, we kind of got an area, and the problem that we've got is that we've got the slideshow and then the thumbnails below it. We've got a situation here. Is this a static size, so a size that doesn't change, and therefore if text, you know, if we get too much text, do we just cut off the text, or is there a scroll bar? Okay, you know, those are the two options. If it is dynamic in that the height of this will change, well, that has an issue with the thumbnails, because then it will push the thumbnails down, and then depending on how much the description is here, we'll see the thumbnails moving up and down all the time, and that may not look very nice. So I would probably go for a scroll bar here. So, you know, we've got a set size for the description, and if it's smaller, then, you know, it's just a small space in there, and if it's too large, then there's a scroll bar, and that allows this to keep its shape, because again, we don't know what else is around our slideshow. This could be the only thing on the page. It could be one of 50 things in a page. It could be the banner of the website. Okay, it could be that, and one of the things that aren't in here, that there are no thumbnails being shown, and this is just a sort of, you know, slideshow at the top where it's just scrolling through the different images. So I would say that this needs to be fixed if it's going to be used. Okay, and I say this is not an exhaustive list. This is just a bunch of ideas I came up with straight away, and the solutions that I see, you know, going forward. We're going to come across a lot more issues as we start to code this, you know, and we'll deal with those as we go along. I will keep this file and we will add to it as we see. And like I say, you know, I've given us a verbal feedback on what I think the answers would be. Obviously, you would write these down so that you can prove, you know, your thought process and to keep yourself on track. Okay, so this is an interesting video because no code's been written. Okay, well, a tiny bit of code, but none for you to follow. But I say this is really important, and it's, you know, it's taken what, less than half an hour to do this, and it's important because this half hour shapes the next, I don't know how many hours that are going to follow. And if we don't have a plan of what we're doing, then, you know, it will take a lot longer. And on top of that, it keeps us focused. And then if things change, we can come back to this and say, well, okay, this is what I was originally going to do. This is where we're going to go now. Does that change anything else? Does any changes I make, does it, if I decide that, for example, go back to this, that I don't want to have the description of the image at all, does that affect any of the other decisions being made here? Do you see any other issues as well? We've got a comment section below. It's very lonely at the moment. Please add comments, tell me if there's another consideration you think I should be looking at that I need to do, before I make my next video on this. And if there's a good one, I'll add it in. I'll give you your shout out and your comment, and we'll take it from there. Okay, so like I said, this is the end of the video. Thank you for staying with me. The next video, we're going to start some of the coding. I'm Zen. See you next time. Signing out.